On May 2nd, 2026, Beijing crossed a line it had never crossed in the entire history of U.S.-China relations. For the first time ever, China officially activated its blocking rules, a domestic statute introduced in 2021 with one clear purpose: neutralizing American secondary sanctions. Then came the move that stunned global markets. Chinese authorities delivered a compulsory legal directive to 5 of the country's biggest oil refineries. Those facilities handle close to $100 billion in Iranian crude every single year. China purchases more than 80% of all oil exported by Iran worldwide, turning these refineries into the core engine sustaining Tehran's energy income. The message issued by Beijing was direct and uncompromising. American sanctions would not be acknowledged. They would not be implemented. They would not be obeyed. For the first time on record, compliance with U.S. sanctions was transformed into a direct violation of Chinese law. Washington's maximum pressure operation against Iran, publicly branded as Operation Economic Fury, suddenly collided with something it had never faced before: a sovereign legal retaliation from the world's second-largest economy. The strength of the dollar-based sanctions machine has always depended on one assumption above all others: that no nation powerful enough would openly refuse compliance. On May 2nd, 2026, China openly rejected that system, publicly, legally, and with named corporations attached to the order. Now, with the Trump-Xi summit scheduled for May 14th through May 15th, only days away, the international financial system is approaching a turning point few people in America fully understand. The implications reach far beyond diplomacy. This conflict touches purchasing power, energy prices, financial stability, and the future structure of the global monetary order itself. To understand the scale of the crisis, the exact legal sequence matters just as much as the political drama surrounding it. On April 24, 2026, the Office of Foreign Assets Control inside the U.S. Treasury Department placed Hengi Petrochemical Dalian onto its specially designated nationals list. American officials described the company as one of Iran's most valuable oil customers. Hengi stands as China's second-largest independent refinery, capable of processing roughly 400,000 barrels every day. Since at least 2023, the refinery has reportedly accepted Iranian crude shipments transported through sanctioned shadow fleet tankers. But Hengi was not alone. 4 additional so-called teapot refineries had already been targeted during 2025: Shandong Jin Petrochemical, Hebshinhai Chemical Group, Shuangluing Petrochemical, and Shandong Shenying Chemical. Under the structure of American secondary sanctions, any financial institution, shipping operator, insurer, or commercial partner anywhere on Earth that continues business with these refineries faces the possibility of losing access to the U.S. dollar system entirely. That is where the true power of Washington's sanctions architecture emerges. A bank in Singapore processing payments connected to Hengi. Even if the transaction is conducted in yuan, even if routed through non-American institutions, can still face exposure to U.S. sanctions whenever any American nexus exists within the transaction chain. This is the extraterritorial reach of U.S. financial dominance. The mechanism works because Washington does not need to directly control every transaction worldwide. The fear of losing access to dollar clearing and correspondent banking is usually enough to force global compliance automatically. But China's Ministry of Commerce conducted its own legal review and reached a very different conclusion. According to Beijing, these American measures represented an illegitimate extraterritorial extension of foreign law, one that violated accepted international legal norms. Based on that determination, China activated the blocking statute for the first time since its passage 5 years earlier. The resulting prohibition order now prevents any company operating inside China from recognizing, enforcing, or complying with those American sanctions. That single decision created an impossible trap for multinational corporations: a European insurer, a Singaporean bank, a South Korean shipping conglomerate. Any company with business exposure in both China and the United States now faces contradictory legal commands from the 2 largest economies on the planet. Follow American sanctions, and the company remains aligned with U.S. law, but simultaneously violates Chinese domestic rules while exposing itself to civil liability under China's anti-foreign sanctions law. Ignore American sanctions in order to satisfy Beijing's directive, and the opposite danger appears immediately. The company protects its operations inside China, yet risks losing access to dollar clearing systems, correspondent banking relationships, and potentially the entire U.S. financial network. Professor Henry Gao from Singapore Management University described the situation with chilling clarity. This marked the first activation of the statute since 2021, and it effectively forces multinational corporations to choose between markets. Choose Washington or choose Beijing. For corporations operating across both superpowers, this is no longer a hypothetical policy debate buried inside legal departments. The crisis is immediate. Operational decisions now carry geopolitical consequences measured in billions of dollars. Inside major banks across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, legal departments are now racing through emergency scenarios. Every institution is trying to calculate the same terrifying equation. Which legal threat is more dangerous? Which market can survive being lost? And is the only workable answer a physical separation between China-linked operations and businesses exposed to the United States financial system? But buried underneath the headlines sits the most important detail in this entire confrontation, a detail much of the global coverage failed to recognize. Even after Beijing activated the blocking order, China's own state-controlled banks quietly refused to issue new yuan-denominated loans to the sanctioned refineries. These four institutions, the largest banks in China measured by total assets, received private guidance from the National Financial Regulatory Administration, instructing lenders to reevaluate exposure tied to the affected companies and suspend fresh credit support. Then came another signal from Washington. Treasury Secretary Scott Bassent confirmed that formal warning notices had been delivered to two unnamed Chinese banks. The message was unmistakable. Continue facilitating Iranian oil payments and secondary sanctions could follow. That created a contradiction impossible to ignore. Publicly, Beijing announced that American sanctions carried no authority inside China. Quietly, its own financial giants behaved as though those same sanctions still mattered enormously. This contradiction reveals the real boundary lines of the conflict. It exposes the limitations of Chinese resistance and the limits of American enforcement at exactly the same moment. China's four largest state banks cannot survive isolation from the dollar network. Their overseas business operations, correspondent banking systems, and global letters of credit all rely heavily on continued access to dollar liquidity. Beijing's blocking order may shield the teapot refineries, but it does not shield ICBC, Bank of China, Agricultural Bank of China, or China Construction Bank from the financial consequences of openly challenging Washington. And yet, despite those limits, the moment remains historic. For the first time ever, Beijing established a legal structure where obeying American sanctions can itself become a violation under Chinese domestic law. Enforcement may still appear partial today, but the framework now exists permanently. At the same time, China continues expanding alternatives to the Western financial system. The Yuan Settlement Network, CAPS, already processes approximately $2,447 trillion annually. Meanwhile, bridge systems connecting central banks throughout Asia and the Middle East continue growing larger every quarter. As those systems expand, the leverage Washington gains from controlling dollar access slowly weakens. Each quarter, CIPS grows stronger. Each petroleum shipment settled outside the SWIFT network chips away at American sanctions power. Every bilateral UN swap agreement established between governments removes another fraction of the dollar's global dominance. The teapot refineries may only be the opening chapter. The Trump-Xi summit scheduled for May 14th now becomes the first major test of whether this legal standoff spirals further or quietly retreats from the brink. China issued a binding national order directing companies to disregard U.S. sanctions. Yet its own state banks quietly acted in accordance with those same sanctions anyway. That contradiction defines the exact point where the immense strength of the dollar collides with the visible limits of its reach in May 2026. The blocking order is real. The summit between Trump and Xi is only 4 days away, and the deeper structural pressures driving this confrontation were never going to disappear in one diplomatic meeting inside Beijing. China remains heavily dependent on Iranian crude. The United States continues escalating pressure tied to Iran. At the same time, a 145% tariff confrontation is unfolding in parallel. None of those forces vanish overnight. Now comes the most critical clarification in this entire story, because intellectual honesty matters here. China's blocking order does not destroy American sanctions power. It simply cannot. Primary U.S. sanctions still fully apply to American citizens, U.S.-based business activity, and every transaction involving a U.S. nexus. The 5 sanctioned refineries remain locked out of American financial institutions. They cannot access U.S. correspondent banks. They cannot route dollar transactions through clearing systems controlled by the United States. Beijing's Ministry of Commerce holds no authority to erase American law inside American territory. What makes the blocking order historically significant is something different entirely. It creates a competing legal obligation for every non-American company operating inside China: a European bank, a Japanese insurer, a South Korean shipping corporation. All of them are suddenly trapped between two sovereign legal systems demanding opposite behavior. Comply with Washington's sanctions, and those firms could face regulatory retaliation, civil lawsuits, or even placement on China's unreliable entity list. Ignore the American restrictions in order to follow Beijing's directive, and the risks shift instantly. Access to dollar clearing could disappear. Correspondent banking relationships could collapse. Entry into U.S. markets could be threatened. Stevenson Harwood, one of the world's leading international law firms specializing in sanctions compliance, described the outcome bluntly in a formal advisory to clients. Banks, insurers, traders, logistics providers, and every counterparty connected to the sanctioned refineries are now trapped directly in the middle. What once looked like a theoretical clash between competing legal systems officially became, on May 2nd, 2026, a real-world conflict of law crisis. And beneath all of it sits the foundation supporting America's sanctions machine. The dominance of the dollar exists because global trade still overwhelmingly relies on dollar-based financial infrastructure. SWIFT continues handling the majority of international payments across the world. Dollar correspondent banking links nearly every major bank on the planet into clearing systems controlled by the United States. Even transactions that never physically enter America often pass through U.S. financial infrastructure somewhere inside the settlement process. A German corporation paying a Chinese supplier in euros may still move through American correspondent banks before the transfer is completed. That hidden routing structure is what gives Washington its global reach. Secondary sanctions transform that reach into a weapon by threatening penalties against any company, institution, or country conducting business with blacklisted entities. This framework becomes overwhelmingly effective when every major economy, even reluctantly, accepts the rules imposed by the United States. But the structure weakens the moment the world's second-largest economy officially declares those rules illegal within its own borders. Not because China's order dismantles dollar infrastructure. It does not. The power of the dollar system remains enormous. What changes is the legal and operational burden placed on multinational corporations, trying to function across both jurisdictions at the same time. And that rising burden pushes exactly the transformation Beijing wants to accelerate. Global corporations are increasingly separating China-facing operations away from businesses tied directly to American exposure. Parallel payment systems are slowly emerging. Separate financial channels are forming. Step by step, dependence on the dollar begins shrinking. The legal framework China activated on May 2nd openly encourages yuan settlement as an alternative path. Oil purchases involving the 5 sanctioned refineries can now increasingly move through yuan-denominated channels processed by CIPS instead of SWIFT. Payments can settle through yuan correspondent accounts rather than dollar accounts and pass through infrastructure carrying no direct exposure to American sanctions enforcement. China's oil for yuan strategy first expanded aggressively using Russian crude in 2022. Later, the same model spread into Iranian oil flowing through the Teapot refinery network. Now, for the first time, that structure has received its strongest legal shield under Chinese domestic law. One institutional analysis summarized the mechanism with striking precision. The oil for yuan cycle transforms sanctioned crude sales into renminbi banking balances, creating a transaction system operating almost entirely outside Western financial infrastructure. In reality, that mechanism has already existed informally for years, but after May 2nd, 2026, it now carries formal legal protection inside China itself. This is where the Trump-Xi summit becomes critically important, and why the May 14th through May 15th meeting may become the most significant financial negotiation since the Plaza Accord. The timing was no accident. Beijing issued the blocking order only 12 days before Donald Trump's arrival in Beijing. The signal behind that move was unmistakable. Xi Jinping believes he holds the stronger position. That assessment did not come from Chinese state media. It appeared in a formal analysis released by a major American financial publication. The blocking order fundamentally changed the summit agenda. The dispute is no longer limited to tariffs, trade deficits, or commodity purchases. The deeper issue now centers on a far more dangerous question. Whose laws ultimately control multinational corporations operating between both superpowers? And that question will not be solved during 2 days of diplomatic meetings. Soybean agreements, Boeing purchases, bilateral trade mechanisms, those outcomes remain possible because they are transactional. But the structural conflict beneath them is something entirely different. China's blocking statute system has now officially been activated against American secondary sanctions for the first time ever. Its anti-foreign sanctions law allows civil actions against entities complying with foreign sanctions that damage Chinese companies. Its unreliable entity list gives Beijing a retaliatory mechanism directly targeting American corporations operating inside China. Then came the 2026 regulations designed to counter what China calls improper foreign extraterritorial jurisdiction, extending the legal structure even further. But none of these tools appeared overnight. Every part of this framework was built gradually between 2019 and 2026 in direct response to the growing American use of sanctions against Chinese-linked entities. That means the blocking order issued on May 2nd was not improvised in response to a sudden crisis. It represented the first public deployment of a legal system Beijing spent 5 years constructing. The 5 Teapot refineries are only the first battlefield. The true objective is establishing precedent. For ordinary Americans, the consequences are measurable and unavoidable. A more fragmented energy market drives global oil prices higher. Multinational corporations, facing contradictory legal systems, experience rising compliance costs, slowing international trade. As confidence in sanctions enforcement weakens, pressure builds upward on U.S. Treasury yields, while the dollar's structural premium gradually narrows. That process feeds directly into mortgage rates remaining elevated. It also compounds borrowing costs tied to America's $39 trillion national debt. None of these effects arrive all at once. Instead, they accumulate quietly, quarter after quarter, year after year. The global financial system slowly adapts to a reality where, for the first time in history, the enforcement power of the dollar has been legally challenged by the world's second largest economy. The summit begins in 4 days. The blocking order is already active. UN settlement systems continue expanding, and the dollar's 50-year dominance over energy trade enforcement has now encountered its most serious legal confrontation yet. If you want deeper breakdowns on the Trump-Xi summit, the future of dollar dominance, and the geopolitical forces reshaping the global economy in real time, stay tuned for the next analysis. The financial war unfolding now will not stay confined to Beijing, Washington, or the Middle East. Its consequences will eventually reach every household connected to the global economy. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.